Sorry, I.
That's okay. Thank you for that introduction, Grace. I think you got it all correct. The one thing I would just add is my primary appointment is at the University of Pittsburgh in communication science and disorders. The CNBC is a joint training program for PhD students in neuroscience across Carnegie Mellon and Pitt. And yes, I'm definitely engaged in that as well. So today I'm going to talk to you about some theoretically driven studies that focus on mechanisms that might underlie speech errors that are elicited by a very particular and very old speech paradigm, which is called delayed auditory feedback, that we've kind of modernized and been using quite a bit in my lab over the last 5 or so years. So in general, the outline here is to first give you a brief and necessarily brief overview into a model that I developed way back in my PhD that kind of guides our thinking about many things in the lab, but especially guides the kind of framing of what we think about here in these studies. And I'm going to kind of fairly quickly go through 4 specific empirical observations of speech under delayed auditory feedback that we've observed in experiments in my lab. And then we'll talk a little bit about how we think we need to extend this model, this GODIVA model, to explain these kinds of observations and what it might kind of mean for our understanding of speech motor control and speech sequencing down the road. So, sorry, I'm going to mute that. So speech production is a serial motor behavior. It gives rise to an acoustic waveform that is sort of inherently one-dimensional. Despite all of this, we put a lot of information into the speech signal, sometimes as many as 20 distinctive sounds or segments per second. And we use a tremendous amount of intricate coordination, perhaps using more motor fibers than any other human motor activity. One important thing for us to think about is that even though speech is a motor behavior, it's directed by something that is at its very nature kind of symbolic and discrete, which is the language system. So we think of speech as comprising these individual strings of sounds, and that requires a lot of machinery to kind of sequence and interface that language system with a more continuous kind of motor system. And that's a lot of what the GODIVA model tries to account for. So this is a problem that's been studied for a very long time. Carl Lashley, the famous psychologist here, described this problem of organizing these kinds of speech sequences as the action syntax problem. And so we can define this effectively as saying that the brain has to rapidly assemble and enact properly ordered and properly timed speech sound sequences. And this is not a trivial problem. It requires kind of forward planning and parallel representation of multiple forthcoming units as we string together speech sounds. So one thing we can take advantage of as we plan speech is that idea that we have a discrete set of sounds, right? So speech is not arbitrary motor movements, but it's based on learned kind of units. And those units can be counted in different ways. For example, we have about 40 phonemes that we use in American English. Of course, there's variation within that. And even at the level of syllables, sort of a higher level linguistic unit, only about 500 syllables account for about 80% of the spoken English that we use. And so we can take advantage of these learned units as we string together sound sequences. And again, speech planning has been studied for many years. And there's kind of 3 different ways that people have tried to understand the planning of speech. And they've elicited very similar kinds of ideas that speech is planned both hierarchically, as is depicted in this kind of, can you see my mouse cursor, by the way?
Yes.
Great. In this kind of hierarchical diagram of a conceptual model from Levelt and colleagues. There are many others that are similar to this from Gary Dell and others. And these types of data come from linguistic performance errors. So naturally occurring slips of the tongue, where if I'm trying to say to you in this talk, speech languages in the left hemisphere, I might say languages in the left hemisphere. These kinds of errors are not random. They obey specific structural constraints, which imply certain kind of organizational principles to how we put these sequences together. We also have data from reaction times or chronometry that show us there are sequence length effects and familiarity effects that show up in differences in reaction time. And these really imply that we have a short-term memory for the utterance that we're trying to say, and we plan that utterance in parallel ahead of time. And of course, co-articulation is a very well understood phenomenon in speech production that implies parallel planning, particularly for look ahead or anticipatory co-articulation. So I have this engineering background that Grace mentioned. I first studied computer and electrical engineering, and this led me to neuroscience. And so I think very sort of mechanistically about how a system works. And I try to get at this idea of like, how can we build a system that would simulate the kinds of behaviors that we see when we do experiments in speech motor control. And that also comes heavily about from having worked during my PhD with Frank Gunther, who is well known for having developed the GODIVA model, which is a model of sensory motor control of speech. And one kind of version of the GODIVA model is depicted here from our chapter in the Routledge Handbook of Phonetics. I just want to walk through a couple pieces of this. So the GODIVA model is a model that learns to control chunks of speech. It can produce simulations that will show you vocal tract movements in speech and also corresponding acoustic outputs like this, maybe.
Good doggy.
So did the sound come through okay?
Yeah.
So this is Diva saying good doggy. And the way that this works is that the model learns the motor commands necessary to adjust the vocal tract to produce a certain set of acoustic sounds. And it does this primarily through the use of a feedback control system. See, the idea is that when you read out a chunk of speech, a word or a syllable to be produced, you read out expectations for what it's going to sound like. And then you use auditory feedback to compare what you're hearing to those expectations. And to the extent that they agree, we're doing well and we don't have to make any changes. But if we see discrepancies in how the auditory feedback matches our expectations, then we can issue learned corrective motor commands to kind of steer the vocal tract to produce the sounds in a way that we were expecting. And so for this reason, the GODIVA model is really well suited to explain the kinds of data that we see when we experimentally perturb auditory feedback. So for example, if we shift the first formant frequency of a sound that a person is producing and listening to, they will tend to compensate by, so if we raise the F1 of that sound, they will tend to compensate by lowering their F1 to make the sound that comes through the headphones they're listening to sort of better match their expectations. And so this is real data from participants doing a formant perturbation task. And then at the right are model simulations that show the same sorts of things. There is also a somatosensory system within the GODIVA model. And of course, these kinds of effects, these kinds of perturbations can also be done there. But I'm going to primarily be talking about the auditory system here for the rest of my talk. GODIVA operates, as it's kind of traditionally described, on chunks of speech. So it learns via this mechanism called the speech sound map, which is hypothesized to exist in the left ventral premotor cortex or the dorsal parts or portions of the inferior frontal gyrus pars opercularis. This speech sound map contains what you can think of as sensory motor chunks. It learns both feed forward commands or kind of the series of movements that are necessary to produce that chunk of speech, but also reads out expectations, right? Both to the auditory system, the auditory feedback control system, and to the somatosensory feedback control system. The thing about this kind of representation is that there is no explicit planning system. In the GODIVA model, you just turn on that chunk and out comes speech. There's no kind of parallel planning. There's no notion of linguistic units or structure. So the representation of cat and bat are essentially completely independent of one another. And of course, we know that that this sort of doesn't make a ton of sense. And we need to kind of build on machinery beyond this that kind of simulates the kinds of things that we do in planning speech. So actual speech requires selecting and sequencing multiple chunks. And that's what we tried to do in constructing the GODIVA model. And I don't have a lot of time to go through this in the kinds of detail. This could be a 2-hour talk on GODIVA, but I want to point you to a couple of the pieces within this diagram. So the GODIVA model has this speech sound map. It's this learned sensory motor repository, hypothesized to exist in the same place as it is in the GODIVA model. But what we added to the model are these two parallel phonological based representations of forthcoming utterances. So this kind of followed from psycholinguistic traditions in a la Gary Dell or Stephanie Shattuck-Hufnagel, thinking about speech as being composed of more abstract kind of frames and content that fills those frames. So there's a lot of data to support the idea that that there is a breakdown of more abstract kinds of sequential representations in the medial premotor areas of the brain, such as the pre-SMA, as we suggested here, and more kind of action-based representations along the lateral surface of the brain, as we've proposed here in this model. This is kind of a more simplified version that appeared in Frank Gunther's 2016 Neural Control of Speech book. And you can see this breakdown, as I mentioned, between the medial premotor areas, which are hypothesized to be more involved in sequential structure and timing, and the lateral areas more involved in phonological content and motor programs. We also have this breakdown into a motor loop that includes a lot of the machinery that has been hypothesized for a while now in the GODIVA model, and now also this kind of higher level planning representation, which essentially mimics what we hypothesized in the GODIVA model. So I just want to kind of show you a little bit of how this model actually works underneath the hood. It hypothesizes that we represent the order of a forthcoming speech sequence through an activation gradient. So if I can turn your attention to the planning layer representation up here, the bars symbolize the amount of activity for a letter in this sequence. And the letter with the highest activity is the one that will be produced first. The one with the second highest activity is the one that will be produced second, third highest third, fourth highest fourth. And so through a mechanism of iterative choice and response suppression, which I'll show you in just one moment, we can select out the next item for performance kind of sequentially and read out a series. And I don't have the data in this set of slides, but there are a few studies now that support this kind of representation as one that we see in the prefrontal cortex in macaques and also in humans. So I just want to show you this kind of in simulation. So now each of these locations along the x-axis is going to correspond to one of these cells activations, and this is going to play out as a movie over time. And so what you're going to see here is first activating the graded activity. So D has the highest activation. Down at the bottom, the D is going to be chosen and then suppressed in the planning layer. Same thing is going to happen for the I now. And it gets suppressed up here. So V is now the lead, has the most activity. It gets chosen and suppressed. And now the A is left over. That's going to be chosen down here and suppressed in the planning layer. And so this exact same movie is now represented as time series on the right. So you can see the planning layer activity has curves that represent each of the 4 letters in the sequence. The purple is the D, The red is the I, the blue is the V, and the gold is the A. And you can see that in the choice layer, you get this kind of winner take all activity that selects out D, then I, then V, then A. So this is the underlying principle of how we think we select out and choose the sound sequence that we're going to produce. This is a simulation in GODIVA that shows GODIVA saying GODIVA. What's represented here are the onset sounds in the syllable sequence GODIVA, so GODIVA, and the vowel sounds O, E, We get selection of the most active sounds. So we get a G down here and an O here. These two chosen sounds in this kind of abstract system then interface with the learned sensory motor programs and sort of select out partially matching sensory motor programs. The most active of those is the best match, which is go, and it's selected for production. So this is kind of the way that the model works. It's set up well to help us understand kind of the sequential flow of selection through a speech plan. It's also really well set up to help us explain speech errors. So errors can be modeled in this kind of a system by just adding noise to the planning representations. So if we simply add noise to these plans for the onset consonants in ga, da, and va, in some of our simulations, the va will sort of accidentally surpass the da in its activation, which will mean it gets chosen earlier. So instead of saying GODIVA, the model would say GOVIDA, which would sort of map on nicely to the kinds of speech sequencing errors that typically occur. And this also helps us to think about explaining things like phonemic paraphasias following damage to Broca's area, and also gets us closer to understanding some communication disorders like apraxia of speech and stuttering, where a lot of the action in the pathology is happening at this level of selection and sequencing rather than at the level of kind of motor control of a sensory motor chunk. Okay. All right, so that is my introduction to GODIVA. I know there's a lot there, but I wanted to get us to that place because we use this model to help us think about the things that we observe when we have participants undergoing delayed auditory feedback. And so we're really interested in perception production interactions in speech. This is an adapted diagram of the famous Dennison-Pinson speech chain. And I want to just highlight this link here, the feedback link. So for example, if we repeat a sound, we get external auditory input. We're supposed to repeat a word like dog. Our brain programs the musculature to do it, and we produce that sound wave, but we also hear ourselves saying it. And we know from experiments like those formant perturbation experiments and also pitch perturbation experiments that we can yield rapid compensatory responses, at least some of the time, when we hear errors via our own self-generated feedback. Okay? However, delaying auditory feedback, so we shift what we hear in time by, say, 200 milliseconds, elicits qualitatively different kinds of responses. In particular, sort of severe fluency problems in many people who are speaking under this kind of conditions. This takes the effect of reduced speech rate, starts, stops, pauses. And what we were really interested in is the appearance of kind of discrete or seemingly discrete kinds of sound substitution errors. So categorical phonological errors that appear in the serial order of the output of that stream of sounds. And so we got really interested in this as a mechanism to kind of latch on to those kinds of sequencing errors. And this led me to kind of really think about the way that we use auditory feedback in running speech. So most of the experiments we've done with auditory feedback manipulations are done with single words or single syllables. So we don't really get much of a chance to look at sort of the effects on kind of running speech. So if you think about the way that we use sensory feedback in an ongoing basis, you know, we can definitely use it in this kind of level at the bottom where we produce a sound, we get some auditory feedback. If it's not what we're expecting, we can manipulate it in real time. That's what those formant and pitch shift experiments tell us. But there's probably another level, a sort of higher level loop that we use for phonological error monitoring. So we hear ourselves, we listen to ourselves, and we correct our mistakes, right? So we produce the wrong sound via a slip of the tongue. We don't just let that go. We hear it and we sort of check off the production of intended sounds. We correct the slips of the tongue by reconfiguring our speech plans. And we do this all the time, actually. Some estimates say we make about 1 to 2 errors or slips of the tongue per 1,000 words. So this is a pretty common kind of thing that we need to do. And so it's something that hasn't been tapped into quite so much experimentally. We also have some ideas about where we think this kind of second level, higher level loop is happening in the brain. I don't have time to go into those experiments, but we think it's primarily involving that planning output buffer in the left inferior frontal sulcus that we talk about in the GODIVA model, but then also bringing in some higher order auditory cortical areas in the posterior superior temporal gyrus and into the posterior superior temporal sulcus. And we see a really tight interaction between these areas across a few different fMRI experiments that we've done in the lab. So we have taken this kind of modernized approach to delayed auditory feedback, which was first used back in 1951, so about 72 years ago. This technique was kind of explored and invented. So we brought in some new machinery. The basic gist of it is that a subject is listening over headphones or earphones. They're talking into typically a head-worn microphone. They're producing some speech that could be directed in a bunch of different ways. It's coming into some modern audio processing devices where we can very tightly control latency and other parameters. Then we delay that signal by a bit relative to the mic signal. We amplify it and we feed it back to them over headphones. We can control this very carefully in real time. And we've also modernized this protocol by kind of turning it into a really tightly controlled set of procedures. So for example, we'll talk about these kinds of CV sequences that subjects are producing that allow us to really get a handle on errors. And we put in this kind of visual metronome signal, which I'll show you in just a minute, to try to get participants to produce their speech at kind of a typical rate rather than slowing down, which I think of as primarily a compensatory mechanism to try to reduce errors, but we are actually very interested in those errors, okay? So just to give you a sense of some of those errors, here are a couple of real examples from data we've collected in the lab. These are subjects who are producing sentences. These are TIMIT database sentences that they hear an exemplar and then they are to mimic that exemplar, try to follow the rate and timing of that. And this was a subject saying, a good attitude is unbeatable with a delay of 250 milliseconds. So, oh, sorry about that. So here was the exemplar.
A good attitude is unbeatable.
That one's a little quiet, but here's the DAF speech.
A good attitude is unbeatable.
We'll play that one more time.
A good attitude is unbeatable.
You may have heard a good attitude is unbeatable. And so that's what's highlighted in red here is essentially a syllable repetition, fairly similar acoustics that occur there. Here is a participant producing mom strongly dislikes appetizers with a delay of 200 milliseconds.
Mom strongly dislikes appetizers.
So certainly at the end there's a really strong rate reduction, but along the way, we heard mom strongly dislikes appetizers. And so you get this kind of nice repeated, relatively short syllabic segment that appears within this. And so these are the kinds of errors we're really interested in under DAF. And so I'm going to talk about 4 observations that we've seen experimentally. The first one asks this question of what types of errors are actually elicited by DAF. And this was a study we published in 2022. You can look that up. The participants here were 16 neurotypical Native American English speakers, and they produced these really tightly controlled CV sequences. So they're composed of stops, voice stops, ba, da, ga, and the vowels a, I, u. There were no repeated phonemes, so they would get a target sequence like ba, di, gu, and their job was to repeatedly produce that sequence over a 5-second production interval. And during that interval, they're cued by a visual metronome that tries to get them to approximately pace their production at a syllabic rate of 5 hertz or 5 syllables per second. So they're saying something like body goo, body goo, body goo, body goo, body goo, body goo. Along the way, they will get a feedback delay that is chosen pseudo-randomly between 0 and 250 milliseconds in chunks of 50 milliseconds. And we made these poor subjects do quite a lot of this. So they did 60 trials per block in about 11-minute blocks. And most of the participants did 5 of those. Okay, so here's what it looks like effectively. So you see this sequence, Budagi, commit it to memory. Let's say Budagi, 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 and then stop. And here comes the next one. Now that was easy for me because the delay, there was no delay, but if you were listening to me in particular with a 200 millisecond delay, you would have heard many, many errors because I think I'm the most affected person by PAF in the entire world. Okay, so you got the idea. So we collected a lot of trials, 4,080 total trials across participants. And then we went through a painstaking process of manually transcribing the speech output using a really simple kind of phonetic inventory. So we can talk about those details a bit later if you're interested. When we heard errors, then each error trial was transcribed by at least 2 listeners, and a 3rd listener came in to resolve any discrepancies if there were disagreements between those 2. For about 5% of trials, we couldn't get agreement across all 3, so we discarded those from the analysis. Taking those transcriptions, we then ran them through some custom scripts we developed in MATLAB to automatically classify the errors that were produced, or no error, into 13 different types. And I'll show you those in a minute. And then we modeled the data to ask if the probability of an error of any particular type was affected by delay. And we also included random intercepts for subject and the particular sequence in a generalized linear mixed effects model. Okay, I'm not going to go into those details. So the classification scheme that we used for errors was based on the literature of naturally occurring slips of the tongue. So this includes things like repetition errors, exchange errors, anticipation errors, and these can occur at the level of the individual phonetic units, so vowels or consonants, or at the level of whole syllables. And so, for example, a vowel repetition for the target sequence of ba-di-gu, the subject might say ba-di-gu, ba-da-gu, right? So that would be a vowel repetition. And you can kind of go on and walk through these different pieces. We also included an error type, which we call an onset disfluency, something similar to what people have previously called an artificial stutter. So for example, if the subject said ba-di-ga-gu without a clear intervening vowel, we would classify that as an onset disfluency. We also included severe distortions of vowels that didn't clearly sort of jump into the category of some other sound in the inventory that we were using. Okay, so to the results. So what's shown here is a figure that shows 4 panels, and each of the panels has an x-axis, which is the delay from 0 to 250 milliseconds. And each of the lines corresponds to a specific error type. And it shows on the y-axis the probability of an error of that type under a given delay. And so I'll point you to a few different error types here. You see vowel repetitions in pink that go up at quite a high rate and kind of saturate at 200 milliseconds. These are clearly affected by the delay. We also see that whole syllable repetitions show a very similar effect, although to a lesser magnitude. We can see vowel exchanges jump up a little bit. The stars indicate statistical significance with our mixed effects modeling framework. So at 250 milliseconds, those are significant. And we can see distortions, which are primarily driven by vowel distortions, also show this same kind of effect. So the take home from this is that delayed auditory feedback doesn't elicit just sort of errors across the board, but it drives a fairly specific pattern that involves primarily vowel and whole syllable repetitions, as well as vowel distortions. Consonants, interestingly, are largely unaffected. So you can see, for example, consonant repetitions, we just don't see an increase. Consonant exchanges are pretty common for these kind of tricky non-word stimuli, but they don't change at all with the length of the delay. So consonants are largely unaffected. So this gives us this question of how does a delayed feedback signal cause what looks like kind of involuntary reactivations or failures to suppress the representations of the repeated elements. So the vowel comes out twice in a row, or the syllable comes out twice in a row in these kinds of data. Okay, so you can ask question number 2, but are these errors actually discrete substitution errors? So we know that our perception is heavily biased towards hearing things in a categorical way. We could say, well, you know, you said there's a vowel repetition, but was it really a repetition, or was it something a little bit different than that? So to get there, we did a study using electromagnetic articulography, which I know is something that's being used in the department there at University of Florida, to ask whether the kinematic patterns that we observe during syllable productions under DAF kind of map onto these discrete sound errors. And so electromagnetic articulography, we use an NDI wave, Northern Digital Wave, and we attach these sensors to the lips and tongue, and we measure movements at a frequency, at a sampling rate of 100 hertz in this case. We simultaneously measure the acoustics, same kind of paradigm. Participants are producing these CV sequences, but we limited the delays to just 1 200 millisecond delay or 0 sort of normal feedback. And the delays happen on 75% of the trials in this experiment. And the reason for that is because we wanted to elicit a lot of errors so that we could really sort of take a good look at those. And subjects don't really want to be in an EMMA study for multiple hours. And in fact, many times the sensors would kind of fall off earlier than we had hoped. So we wanted to make sure we get a kind of a critical mass of data. So this is data from 8 participants, okay? So they're doing the same kind of task. And we transcribed the audio from this task using text grids. And we kind of took a simpler approach where we just classified things into categorical errors, distortion errors, these kinds of induced stutters or onset disfluencies, and also some out of set errors where they just made some extraneous sounds, okay? So you can see these are the 8 different participants, and they were differently affected. So really sort of 5 of them made a lot of errors and 3 of them made a few less. But we have a bunch of distortion errors, but a good number of categorical errors that our listeners heard as clean productions of the wrong sound, right? So these are our kind of discrete sound errors. So we took a fairly different approach from what is typical in EMMA, and we cut our EMMA data up into syllable-sized chunks across all of the sensor trajectories. And from that, we concatenated that data into feature vectors, sort of these very high dimensional feature vectors that represent the movement pattern that corresponded to the production of that particular syllable under whatever condition it was being produced in. Then we handed those feature vectors to a machine learning algorithm. This is one called quadratic discriminant analysis. And we trained a series of 6 classifiers, that corresponded to the 6 syllables that we used in this task. So one classifier's job was to say, is this data an example of the subject saying B? And it could give only a yes or no answer, right? So it's a binary classifier. Is this a production of my syllable? Boo gets trained to learn to classify, these are versions of boo, these are not versions of boo, and so on, okay? So the idea then is we could train the data on the syllables that our listeners heard as good, clean productions. And when we do that, we find that we get about 95% correct. So this classifier is very capable of classifying the syllables into these 6 groups based simply on the kinematic data. But the trick was now, let's take the error productions and submit them to each classifier independently and say, does the classifier agree? Does it hear it as just the syllable that the listener heard, or maybe something different? Okay, so we did that, and these are the results. And I'm going to point you only over on the right side to those categorical errors that our listeners heard. So these were the errors that our listeners said were clean sound substitutions. And so when we submitted these to this bank of 6 classifiers, we saw that 43% of these categorical errors, the classifier agreed with the listener. It said, it's the syllable you labeled it as, and just that, we're done. But only 43% of the time. And then there's a second group here where 20% of the time, interestingly, both the classifier corresponding to what the listener transcribed and the classifier corresponding to the original stimulus, which was the target syllable, they both said, this is me. And so we take that as evidence to suggest that what's actually going on there is a kind of a blended production of both the target and the perceived syllable. So this gives us kind of this lingering question of, are error productions under DAF actually, at least in some cases, blends or co-productions that we just hear as kind of discrete sound substitutions? And of course, thinking mechanistically, how would the feedback signal drive these kinds of effects if they're really there? So we've recently taken this approach at a much larger scale for an NSF-funded study. We've extended this now to 56 adult participants, 44 of whom have completed a second session. And then 26 additional participants have done a separate DAF-based adaptation protocol. So we've charted hours of auditory feedback responses for this large group, producing syllable sequences of various types as well as sentences under delayed auditory feedback. We also are collecting formant-shifted auditory feedback and a bunch of kind of baseline measures like speaking rate, synchronization measures, perceptual, just noticeable differences, things like that. This is ongoing data analysis, but I'm sort of flagging for you, if you're interested in this, we're going to make this data set publicly available, hopefully as early as this summer, through a public online repository. And it's been very kind of carefully curated and done with really, really systematic procedures. So just a quick glance at that data, right? So we're, as I say, very much ongoing data analysis, but across the 3 different conditions, we have 3 syllable sequences here, 4 syllable sequences here, and sentences. We see consistent effects where delayed auditory feedback slows the participants down, even when we're giving them some pressure to maintain rate with these visual signals. We think this is, this is a slowing of the selection and sequencing mechanisms. It may give the subjects a little bit of an extra window to hear the feedback they're expecting at the time they're producing those sounds. And this is probably evidence of a speed accuracy trade-off, which is something we're kind of actively investigating. But I want to address a third question now, third empirical observation. How does auditory error affect production under DAF? So if you think about the way that we think about things like formant shifts and pitch shifts, and we see these compensatory responses, the idea is based on a feedback controller. It says that we should take steps to correct any auditory error. And auditory error is just the discrepancy in what we think we should hear from what we're actually hearing when we're producing those sounds. So we took that approach here in kind of a pilot investigation or pilot data analysis from just 5 subjects, where we did this really detailed analysis of auditory error in formant space. So I'm going to kind of give you a picture of what this looks like. But our question was, do subjects kind of compensate for the auditory error during this delayed auditory feedback kind of paradigm? So as I said, 5 speakers here producing timid sentences across 2 sessions with delays between 0 and 250 milliseconds. We manually transcribed what the subjects produced, and then we segmented that using the Montreal Forced Aligner tool, which has been a real godsend for us in this kind of analysis. We then brought it into Pratt and extracted formant frequencies across these productions. Because they produced sounds of different duration, we also resampled all of those at some relative time points using a smoothing spline-based approach that would allow us to compare across different vowels. We required relatively long vowels to do this analysis because we wanted there to be time to see if the subjects kind of steered their vowel from the beginning to the end of that production in a way that could be predicted by an auditory feedback controller. I'm not going to go into the details, but we use this method, this measure called cosine similarity, which is just an indication of if the auditory error is one direction in F1, F2 space, do they go in the same direction, the opposite direction? And this will give us that kind of a measure. So just a little hint of what this looks like. So this is actual data. So this is from a single vowel production of a in the word aptitude. The solid lines are the F1 and the F2 that were produced. And the dashed lines are the feedback that they're hearing simultaneously with what they're producing. And this was a 250 millisecond delay in this case. So if you think about what they're hearing early in the vowel, they're hearing, for example, the F2 that they hear is higher than the F2 they're producing. So you could think of that as an auditory error or a discrepancy. So we take that data and we turn that into a vector in F1, F2 space, which is what's schematized down here by this kind of gold line. So this is the direction of the error in F1, F2 space. And if you kind of look at this up here, you would say if you were trying to compensate for this error, your F2 is higher than what you're expecting, then what you should do is you should bring your F2 down. That's what the feedback control model would say. And that would look like in our schematic down here of bringing a blue line, which represents how you're updating your production, into alignment or close to alignment with that gold error direction. But what we see here is quite the opposite, right? This subject doesn't bring her F2 down, she actually brings it up, right? So she's almost kind of going up to match the F2 that was being heard earlier. And so this would look like what's been called a following response in formant and pitch shift experiments, where the subject kind of steers into the feedback rather than opposing it. And in fact, if we look through all of this data, we see really clear signs that this is exactly what the subjects are doing. So the cosine similarity score, when we have a negative value, that is like a following response. When we have a positive value, that's like an opposing or compensatory response. And the x-axis here corresponds to time from early in the vowel till 200 milliseconds later in the vowel. And what we see is that over time, very consistently across all of the delays, the subjects are actually steering into the feedback. So they're going towards the feedback they were hearing early in the vowel, even though this should be a relatively steady state vowel. And just to kind of follow that up, we also separated it out into stressed and unstressed vowels, with the idea being that maybe the stressed vowels are the ones where we're more tuned into that feedback. And in fact, that's what we see, that the stressed vowels show that following pattern, whereas the unstressed vowels show sort of less of a clear pattern. Again, I just want to emphasize this is really preliminary data. It's just from 5 participants, but it's very much counter to the predictions of feedback control models. So we need another explanation in order to get to this, to explain this data. And then the final thing, which I just want to say really quickly, one lingering question we might have is DAF really just a generic interference effect? So this was put forward by Howell and colleagues back in the 1980s through something called the disrupted rhythm hypothesis. So they said that it's not the specific syllabic units, it's not their identity that matters, it's just the rhythms. The fact that these rhythms are not quite synchronous is really what's driving the disruption. Now, the developing model that we have been working on suggests quite the opposite, that the DAF effect should depend on the identities of the phonemes and syllables. And so we wanted to test that explicitly. So our question is, do the effects depend on the presence of phonetic information in the delayed feedback signal? So we built a little method to look at that. So I'm just going to kind of give you what that sounds like. So here's an exemplar sentence.
Alfalfa is healthy for you.
Can you guys hear that? Alfalfa is healthy for you. Here's a subject producing that.
Alfalfa is healthy for you.
And here is what we call a delayed envelope modulated noise signal. So what we've done is we've multiplied 85 dB speech-shaped noise by an envelope that we extract out in real time in really short temporal windows. So it sounds like this. So you can see in the time domain, it has the same approximate envelope as what the subject produced, but we shift that around by 200 milliseconds and say, hey, if it's just the rhythm that matters, then they should be affected by this kind of a signal just as much or close to as much as through kind of canonical delayed feedback.
Alfalfa.
Whoops, sorry about that.
Alfalfa.
But we see something quite the opposite. So in 27 subjects, again, this is unpublished data, ongoing data analysis, but we see that canonical DAF impacts the speech rate and the number of errors produced, but this delayed envelope modulated noise does nothing, okay? So the conditions are shown here by the different boxes in the box plot. So this is kind of zero delay normal feedback. This is canonical DAF at 200 millisecond delay. They slow down quite a lot. We have a constant noise masker condition. That's this one, doesn't affect anything. This is instantaneous delayed envelope modulated noise. And then this is 200 millisecond delayed envelope modulated noise. This is the condition we just heard. It doesn't change the rate at all, okay? So this does not cause the same kinds of effects. When we look at errors, this is the normal feedback. This is delayed by 200 milliseconds in the canonical way. Each line is an individual subject of our N is of 27. So most of our subjects increase their errors under canonical DAF. Then when we look at that, so now zero delay is in the middle, and our delayed envelope modulated noise instantaneous on the left and 200 millisecond delay on the right. And it's not clear that there's any pattern here. So sometimes people do increase their error rate a little bit. Sometimes they decrease it a little bit. Sometimes it stays the same. But clearly that effect is not the same. And it actually does, in fact, depend on the presence of phonetic information in the speech signal. So how do we explain all of these effects? We see that, going over those 4 points again, that DAF drives a dominant pattern of vowel and whole syllable repetition errors. These errors likely include both discrete sound selection errors and also these blends or co-production errors that we saw using electromagnetic articulography. Speakers' vowel formant productions tend to steer toward the delay auditory feedback signals. At least that's what we see from our preliminary data, which goes against the kind of canonical feedback control models. And DAF effects depend on the presence of phonetic information in the feedback signal. So it's not just a generic kind of interference effect. So our kind of working hypothesis is that the delayed auditory feedback signal is acting more like an external speech input than one that you are kind of coupling to your own speech and trying to directly adjust for. So let's think about how that could work. So we know that when we speak, we have this phenomenon known as speaking-induced suppression. What that means is that we set up our auditory cortex by reducing its excitability, which gives rise to smaller auditory evoked potentials for self-produced speech compared to hearing that exact same speech signal during a passive listening task. So there's an active kind of modulation to suppress responses in the auditory cortex. And this has been seen in other animals. This has been seen across different kinds of recording modalities, et cetera. So our idea is that, again, this has been done for speech in isolation, single syllables, single words. But we think for rhythmic speech, we could couple kind of frontal and temporal oscillatory activity to provide essentially temporal windows of reduced excitability. So, hey, you're going to get a syllable nucleus now, you're going to get another one now, you're going to get another one now. And we don't want our auditory cortex to kind of respond too drastically to hearing our self-produced speech. So this can kind of give us a mechanism for separating internally versus externally generated speech. So we're going after this idea right now. And this is kind of a schematic of what we think is going on. So this is a simplified version of the GODIVA model. So these are our onsets and our vowels in the production of something like ba, di, gu. So again, the order is coding for the order in which they'll be selected. So we select out the ba and the ah. Here's the syllable plan representation. Then we select something to actually be produced. So our thinking is that through rhythmic speech, as we've kind of pushed our subjects to produce, we get this kind of rhythmic selection signal. Hey, the frontal cortex says something's coming now, something's coming now, something's coming now. And that can be coupled to the auditory cortex excitability through phase coupling of these rhythms, which is something that's been observed repeatedly across different brain areas. Now, when we delay feedback, what happens is the feedback signal hits the auditory cortex at a period of enhanced excitability rather than reduced excitability. Okay, so here's the mechanistic proposal, that the delayed auditory inputs arrive at these periods of auditory cortical hyperexcitability. This in turn increases the activity in the planning representations for the heard sounds. So basically going back to this, the feedback-based inputs can give extra activity to the plan representations of syllables or vowels, preferentially those units because they have so much auditory saliency. Since these inputs that are hitting the auditory cortex at strange times are also the most recently produced sounds, then they really increase the chance of sound repetitions to occur. And we've modeled this, I'll show you in just one second. Partial activations of those previous sounds could also directly lead to co-productions, like we think we're seeing in the EMMA studies, and following type responses, because instead of sending out one auditory goal, we're sending out a blend of two auditory goals, which would look like following the auditory feedback. So it kind of explains a lot of what we think we're observing. And we've modeled it. There's a lot to see here. These are more of those GODIVA style simulations. These are the representations of the ba, da, and ga in the planning layer. They get selected. Here are the vowels a, e, and u. They get selected, and their co-selection activates the syllable motor programs to be produced. I'm not going to go through all these details, but what you can see is that through this mechanism where we allow the auditory excitability to be modulated by the selection signal, and we delay it by one arbitrary unit in these simulations, what we can get is some extra activity going back to the vowel planning layer that results in, instead of saying body goo, body goo, body goo, body goo, this model will say body goo, body, e, b, and it latches on to that vowel e and repeats it. Now the model would actually go on repeating it beyond this point, which is something we need to think about, but it's kind of proof of principle that we can get this kind of effect through the mechanism that we've suggested. We've also modeled this for syllable repetition errors, and we get the same kinds of effects that kind of mimic what we see in the feedback or in the experiments. All right, so to summarize, the GODIVA model provides us with a neurobiologically grounded computational model of planning and producing speech sequences. This is nice for allowing us to investigate these kinds of sequential phenomena that we see in DAF. It's also a general theoretical framework that helps us interpret results and generate new hypotheses. We saw that DAF interferes with speech sequencing. It provides an opportunity for us to understand what we think of as higher level perception production interactions than what's typically looked at with pitch shift or formant shift type experiments. And we think that coupling of frontal and auditory rhythms could provide one mechanism for temporally binding the motor and the motor system's representation and the expected consequences of that sound, which would help us to explain repetition errors and blended productions and so on during speech under DAF. This hypothesis, I don't have time to get into it, but certainly has some clinical implications as well, particularly for people who stutter, where we think that some of these rhythms may be atypical and some of the coupling between the auditory and the motor systems in particular may not be neurotypical. We have a bunch of future directions. We're going after this hypothesis directly by manipulating frontal auditory coupling using transcranial transcranial alternating current stimulation in these kinds of tasks. And we're looking forward to doing some work trying to really map out these frontal auditory interactions during speech planning and production using 7 Tesla fMRI. And of course, these results kind of go into extending the GODIVA model to account for these kinds of interactions. So I just want to end by thanking many, many people who've been involved in this work over many years. And I hope I have time for a few questions.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
So, hi, I'm Edith Gahn. We haven't met each other, but thank you so much for doing this. So do we have any questions from the audience here or from the online audience? Buddy? Yeah, Grace has a question.
Okay, so
Sure.
I think in the grand scheme of things, this is a really, really small question, but it was the last slide before your question 2, something
Okay.
about consonants not being affected by something or other.
Sure.
And just the other day, I read an article by Rory Turnbull and his group at UH Manoa. And it was something about vowel mutability and how in different languages, like vowels or consonants or tone information can carry more or less informational weight, if you will.
Okay.
And I just kind of drew some connections. I don't know if you might be able to go back to that slide, but
Yeah, let me see if I can find the one you're talking about. I think I know. See if I can jump back here.
and there might not even be connections, like I might just be drawing like erroneous.
Yeah, so this one.
Yes.
Oh, I don't have the hold on. There are the words that go with it.
Oh yeah. So I guess I'm wondering, guys, vowel and whole syllable repetition errors. Yeah, I'm wondering if like this comes from the fact that I guess in English vowels are the least informational.
I
And
see.
maybe that's why there's the repetition errors on vowels.
That's
and
really
not-
interesting, actually. I haven't thought about it from like an information theory point of view, which is a good one. Basically, that you know, if I think what you're getting at is like you want to really preserve the consonants because they carry the information, right? So they should be somehow less adaptable to these kinds of conditions. Am I reading that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that's a nice idea for sure. We will have some data from this larger study. We have immense amounts of data from this larger study where we've used many more consonants and we've put them in different contexts, both pre and post vocalic, for example. So I'm really interested in getting at whether this idea that the consonants are largely unaffected actually holds up across many different kinds of contexts. It does seem to hold up in the sentences, so that's a good indication, but we're still getting there in this. What I think about with this is that for at least in this first study, right, these were all stop consonants, so they're voiced stops, ba, da, and ga. So there's a very clear tactile cue associated with the stop and the stop release. And so we also have a somatosensory system. And in some sense, the auditory and the somatosensory system are in competition with one another when you are only varying auditory feedback, right? So if you were to adjust, if you were to change those consonants in some way, you would essentially be causing violations in the somatosensory feedback, where they have such a clear tactile cue associated with them, like that should resist that, right? So in many ways, what I think we're seeing here is that the consonants might respond to somatosensory perturbations, whereas the vowels are, there's a lot more wiggle room in the tactile and for the somatosensory information, proprioceptive information that comes in from tongue position that varies just a little bit as you change, sort of steer these formants, et cetera. So I think we're looking at kind of the competing somatosensory and auditory systems in a sense here. That's kind of been my way of thinking about it.